Got it.
Okay, so good evening, everybody.
Good.
So a couple of weeks ago, we started a discussion of how COVID and Zoom changed Judaism forever. And towards the end of the discussion, I thought Toby made a really good point that maybe what's changed is some of our practices or some of our expressions, but that's not a fundamental change in Judaism itself. And it's an interesting point. Um, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree, but I'm not sure that I necessarily disagree either. It's a challenging point, and to what extent can practices anyway, it's an interesting point which I'm still thinking about, but I wanted to continue that discussion because one of the points that I tried to make 2 weeks ago, and this is not like unique to me, this is not like my personal Kiddush. I don't know how you say Kiddush in English. This is like not something that I came up with, but that the pandemic simply speeded up things that were occurring anyway or were going to occur anyway. But I want to look at some data because you guys know that I love data, which is weird because I hated math in school, but I love data. Look at some of the data that indicates some of the trends that I'm talking about. Okay, so and I've done a couple of classes on this particular body of material in the past. There was a very, very thorough demographic study of the greater Washington Jewish community that was done in 2017. Okay. And one of the things that blew everybody away is the fact that there are more Jews in Northern Virginia than there are in Montgomery County. Okay. And I remember there was some writer who said the problem ain't what he don't know, it's what he does know that ain't necessarily so. And if you had asked before this data came out, and if you had said to somebody, there are more Jews in Northern Virginia than Montgomery County, everybody would have said you are nuts, right? I mean, the assumption is Jews live in Montgomery County. If you look where all of the Jewish institutions are, the Federation, the Hebrew Home, the day school, the kosher stores and restaurants, they're all in Montgomery County. I mean, institutionally, Northern Virginia is still kind of a wasteland, but the fact of the matter is that roughly 42% of, at least in 2017, roughly 42% of the greater Washington Jewish community was in Northern Virginia and 39% in Montgomery County. Another interesting statistic was between 2002 and 2017, the total number of members of synagogues was exactly the same, within 100 units, more or less. Okay, 2002, 2017, exactly the same number of Jews belong to synagogues in the greater Washington area. Question, good or bad? I mean, what is the significance of that number? Yeah, Dee, go ahead.
I don't think it's good or bad. I think it's just descriptive.
and good or bad depends upon whether you live in Northern Virginia or whether you live in Montgomery County.
No, it has nothing to do. I mean, this particular number has nothing to do with Northern Virginia or Montgomery County, right? I mean, there were exactly as many synagogue members in the greater Washington area in 2017 as there were in 2002, right? So, I mean, figures don't lie, but liars figure, right? If I want to make the case that at worst there's stagnation, I could point to that figure. Okay, but Mike, you're shaking your head. Okay, why are you shaking your head?
Well, it's unfortunate. I don't think it's stagnation. I think that it's a combination of things. One, and I think it's bad. I think you have to factor in Chabad. And
They
in that
included
period,
Chabad in this figure. They included Chabad in this figure.
that's what I'm saying. And I think that's bad for the rest of us, because it says that the rest of us are fewer compared to what we would have been under what I would call normal circumstances, and I consider Chabad to be an abnormal circumstance. So to that extent, as we're looking at the numbers and saying, what does it mean? You can't say, well, it means that we didn't lose any ground between then and now, because we did, because somebody new on the block is scarfing up otherwise members.
All right, so let me, a couple of things. One is, for the purposes of this demographic study, Chabad is counted as a shul. Okay, sure. So I mean, and one of the things that definitely does happen is that there's cannibalizing, right? I mean, instead of reaching new people, there's cannibalizing, right? I mean, shul X grows and right. Shul Y shrinks. The total pool is the same. It's just rejiggering, right? But Alan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Rabbi, this is not quite on that point, but in order to make any sense of what you're saying, that the synagogue membership has remained constant, what's happened with the Jewish population in Washington? And that's the first thing. And then, frankly, I'd like to know, because I think I know the answer. How are the other, I'm going to say Protestant,
yeah.
How are the Protestant churches doing? The Catholic churches are a little different than us.
Right.
The Protestant churches, I think we track them.
Right. Okay. So let me answer your first question and then take a stab at the second question. I mean, you've homed in on the missing statistic, right? If I say that from 2002 to 2017, the number of synagogue members is fairly identical, that's a meaningless statistic unless you know what is the change in the overall Jewish population, right? And the change in the overall Jewish population, it grew 37% over that same time period, right? So all things being equal, synagogue membership should have grown by 37% also, right? And it didn't, because all things aren't equal, because all things are rarely equal, right? But unless you have that datum, the other statistic is meaningless. Okay, now in terms of your second question, I think that your point is undoubtedly correct. Indeed, I made the same point 2 weeks ago. We don't have, at least I don't have, that granular level of data for the greater Washington area. Okay, I do have some data for national trends, which I'll get to in a little bit. Okay. And I'm, I mean, one of the things back in the 1990s when I first worked in the greater Washington area as a rabbi, when I was the rabbi at AU Hillel, one of the things that everybody knew, okay, in the early 1990s is that the Washington community was sui generis because there were so many transients and people lived here but didn't consider it home. Okay. One of the things that they asked in this 2017 survey is, do you consider the Washington area home? 94% said yes. Okay, so that other thing that everybody knew is now out the window. Okay, I mean, just like everybody knew that most Jews lived in Montgomery County, right? Everybody knew that most Jews didn't really consider this home, and they all went back to New York or wherever for Pesach and the high holidays, and not so. Okay. So the other kind of startling statistic to me, although, I mean, it's a little bit, well, let me give you the statistic and then I'll say why it's a little bit misleading. The percentage of Jewish children who were involved in any sort of formal Jewish education in 2017 was 40%. Okay, now that is a shocking figure. It's a little bit less shocking when you look that it's a K through 12 figure. Okay, and it's not uncommon for kids to drop out after bar mitzvah, right? So, and it doesn't have a breakdown. So it's probably, I mean, it's 40% is a sort of snapshot, but it's probably higher than 40% who get formal Jewish education at some point in their lives. But again, it was a commonplace that everybody got formal Jewish education, at least through bar mitzvah, and then a lot of them dropped out. And it's not everybody, is still probably under 50% if you adjust to take into account the kind of normal post bar or bat mitzvah attrition. Okay, a couple of other things, and these are more national stories that you may or may not be aware of, but these I think are, so that was everything that I gave you up until now was from 2017, so pre-pandemic, okay? But now, post or contemporary with the pandemic, last year, Hebrew Union College announced that they were sunsetting their Cincinnati rabbinical program. Okay. HUC has 3 campuses in the United States: New York, Cincinnati, and Los Angeles. For a long time, I mean, when I was at HUC, you could not get ordained in LA. You could, so year 1 is in Jerusalem. Years 2 through 5 are back in the States. You could go to LA for years 2 and 3, but then you had to finish in Cincinnati or New York. Or you could go Cincinnati all 4 years or New York all 4 years. A number of years ago, already in the 1990s, they started offering a 4-year ordination program in LA, and that was really the death knell of Cincinnati. I mean, because, for the most part, if you could go to school in New York, LA, or Cincinnati, and you're, a Jew as opposed to a Protestant. Now I'm weird. I chose Cincinnati, and the reason that I chose Cincinnati is because back then I was very studious, and Cincinnati was the best place to sort of just sit and learn because you didn't have, you had a dorm and it was a cheap place to live, whereas New York and LA, you had to find your own apartment and they're expensive places. But for the most part, a lot of the people who wound up in Cincinnati were assigned there against their will. And literally, I mean, when you applied, you signed a statement that said, I understand I am applying to the HUC rabbinic program. And while I can express my preference for campus, the school retains the right to assign me wherever they think it's necessary. And then for a while, because the Cincinnati Jewish community is pretty wealthy, because they sold the Jewish hospital and they have this massive now endowment fund. So basically, they decided that the tuition in Cincinnati would be less than half of what it was in New York or LA, and suddenly they had a flood of applicants. And when that program sunset, nobody wanted to go to Cincinnati anymore. So Cincinnati is now sunset. They're keeping the campus, which, is a massive infrastructure and has the third largest Jewish library in the world. And they are starting a new low residency rabbinic program. Okay, so which means that basically it's going to be a mostly online rabbinic school. And then they will have occasional intensives where like everybody in the program has to come to Cincinnati for 2 weeks or whatever. And those will be intensive residential seminars, but most of the program is going to be done online. This is clearly, again, would this have happened absent the pandemic? Maybe. Certainly the pandemic, speeded that up because of the whole, the growth of all kinds of forms of distance learning. I don't even know what to say about this. I mean, I am less invested in the existence of the Cincinnati campus, even though that's where I went to school. But the idea of a 4-year rabbinic program that is mostly online, to me, that is deeply problematic. At the same time that HUC announced this, the American Jewish University in LA, which is the home of the Ziegler School for Rabbinic Studies, so that's the Los Angeles conservative rabbinical school, they are selling their campus. And because they have it, I mean, it's in Brentwood. It's worth a lot of money. Again, many of their programs are now distance learning. They really don't, I mean, they need a campus, but they don't need a 37-acre campus with dorms and lots of classrooms and whatever. So they sold their campus. They're looking for smaller quarters elsewhere in LA, but they also announced that the formerly 5 or 6 year rabbinic program will now be a 4-year program. That the year in Israel will now be a long summer in Israel, like 2 months in Israel rather than a year in Israel. But when you look, and the devil is always in the details, The 4-year, I'll get you in a second now. The 4-year program is really a 3-year program and then an internship year. Now, the internship is great. I mean, you learn how to be a rabbi by being a rabbi, but I'm not sure that 3 years plus a supervised internship is really sufficient. Alan.
Rabbi, thank you. And you're making the point that you've indicated before, and that is that we're in a decline. You said in the announcement of this class that you went to Hebrew, you went to university, or you went to seminary with Danny Schiff,
Yeah.
who wrote this book, Judaism in the Digital Age. And that book really fascinates me. I have not read it. I just read a couple of things about it, one from Forwards. And I hope that you've read it. If not, I plan to read it.
I have not. I've read the same reviews and articles. I have not read the book.
We're both, yeah. But what it said, and I find this just fascinating, is that especially conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, essentially were modern religions in the modern age, meaning modern between like whatever it is, 18, whatever it is, until the 1990s. But that the time has come to move on. The digital age has really influenced and probably moved it along faster.
Right.
His point that was summarized, and I don't know how accurate this is, but the point that was summarized is that the idea now should be to make Judaism more pertinent and not be so worried about having people in the synagogue, having attendance, having members. And I find that fascinating, and I wonder if we can get some discussion as to what Judaism is doing to make it more pertinent.
I will get there. I'm kind of setting the stage, okay? And so I'll set it a little quicker. But one of the points, because you Alan asked the question about Protestants. I mean, the same things that are going on in rabbinic education are also going on in Protestant seminary education, right? The Church Divinity School of the Pacific just sold their campus. It's going to be a 3-year online program. Now, MDiv programs have always been 3 years, so that's not new. And there will be occasional intensives. The intensives will be in New York at Trinity Church. But they are having trouble. A lot of Protestant divinity schools are merging and do it more and more distance learning because they, and part of it is economics too. I mean, people don't have the ability. I mean, you're getting particularly a lot of second career candidates for both the rabbinate and the Protestant ministry. And it's not so easy to take 3, 4, 5 years off. I mean, forget about the question of paying tuition, right? But to take 3, 4, 5 years of not earning a living when you've got kids and whatnot, it is a real problem. It's a real challenge. Okay, so let me get to Danny Schiff's book, okay, what I know about it, but what I know about what I've read, and also, from knowing Danny, okay, because we were very, very close friends in rabbinical school. So Danny says that Reform and conservative Judaism in particular were responses to modernity, that modernity ended in 1990, and the pandemic just accelerated changes which were already happening. Okay, now, to somebody who has studied history, modernity has a certain very specific meaning. Okay. And in Jewish history, all the more so, right? I mean, how can, because on the surface, what do you mean modernity ended in 1990? Right? I mean, modern is what's happening now, right? But modernity for Jews, okay, the big question of modernity was, how do I fit into Western society while still maintaining my Jewishness, right? That is the biggest challenge of modernity, right? And I would maintain that every single phenomenon in Jewish life is an attempt to answer that question. Okay, whether it's reform, which, I mean, and I'm certainly deeply critical of reform. I mean, reform to me is like instead of a Jewish lifestyle, it's a Jewish style life, right? In the same way that a kosher style deli means, spicy meat, but still treif. But it is an attempt to stay Jewish, but also fit in to Western society. Conservative Judaism is a different attempt. Modern Orthodoxy is a different attempt, and in many ways, I believe that conservative and modern Orthodoxy are closer than either are to reform. Now, I mean, Mike, you mentioned Chabad. Okay, and Chabad would say, oh, we're not like that. We're not a response to modernity at all. We are just doing what Jews have always done, right? Because as you know, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, he was wearing a black hat and a kappata and speaking Yiddish. But even ultra orthodoxy is a response to modernity. I mean, it is essentially maybe a reactionary response to modernity, but it's still a response to modernity, right? By building the ghetto wall in a different form, right? Zionism is also a response to modernity, right? That is to say that Jews can't assimilate, so we become like everybody else by being our own nation, right? I mean, they're all responses to modernity. And in a certain sense, Zionism and assimilation are opposite sides of the same coin. That is to say, right? In other words, we can't fit in, right? So Zionism says we can't fit in, so we'll set up our own country. And assimilationists say we can't fit in, so we'll stop being Jewish, right? I mean, and Herzl, I mean, explicitly said those are the only two alternatives. Those are the only two alternatives. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with him, but that's what Herzl said, right? But the challenges of, let's say, post-modernity are not the same thing, right? I mean, I think in many ways, the current contemporary quest is not for fitting in so much as it is for meaning, right? How to live a meaningful life, right? Or as I once said to my dad, for the children of immigrants, right? My dad grew up, I know I'm Jewish. I know I'm Jewish, right? The question is, how do I learn how to be an American, right? I grew up, I know I'm American. How do I learn how to be a Jew? Right? It's a completely different quest, right? And that is also not unique to Jews. In sociology, there's what's known as Hanson's Law, which says that what the second generation jettisons, the third generation seeks to reclaim, right? But for the most part, I mean, yes, there's been a rise of anti-Semitism lately, okay? But the question is, I mean, I do not, perhaps naively, and if you want to say I'm naive, I'll say perhaps, I don't believe that the kind of anti-Semitism that we are seeing in American society threatens the Jews' place in American society, right? It is offensive. It is sometimes more than offensive, right? But kids writing graffiti on school lockers is not yet the road to Auschwitz, right? I mean, it needs to be fought and it needs to concern us. And certainly, you know, if the government is willing to give us money for security cameras and alarms and locks and hardening our windows, we should certainly take it and do all those things. But I still don't believe that that fundamentally threatens, you know, our place in society, right? But you know, there's also, I mean, and this is more an intellectual Jewish indication of post-modernity, okay? And you know, this may be frankly more of concern to me than to any of you, but you know, sometimes I will say to people, you know, when I went to rabbinical school in the 1880s, we did blah, blah, blah. And they say, what are you talking about? 1980, the same thing, right? Because HUC and JTS were the last two German universities left in the world, right? The entire model of education through the 1980s was what's known as Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism, right? And so, for example, every verse in the Bible had one and only one meaning, and the way to understand that meaning was to learn Hittite and Akkadian and you know, Canaanite and Cuneic and all these cognates. And if you learned enough philology and grammar, you could find the one and only meaning of a particular verse. All right, which is why I went to HUC determined to concentrate in Bible and wound up taking the minimum courses required in Bible and concentrating in Talmud and history, because that method of learning meant nothing to me. Okay. Whereas a postmodern, I mean, and this is different from orthodoxy. Okay. I absolutely accept that the Torah has human elements, it changed over time, sources, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't matter. Okay. It doesn't matter because even if it's not from God, it is the formative text of the Jewish people. Right. And if you want to be part of the Jewish story is based in that text and the way Jews have studied it, which has never said there's one and only one meaning, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that, and this is what I've tried to teach you all to do, which is to accept scientific biblical criticism and embrace the traditional understanding of the Torah simultaneously, right? You do not have to choose between intellectual honesty and faithfulness to tradition. You can do both. Okay, indeed, you should do both. And this is a postmodern move. It is absolutely a postmodern move because it is less concerned with history and philology and more concerned with meaning. And meaning is really very, very individual. Right. So what Danny says, based on what I've read about his book, is essentially the postmodern questions are different questions than the modern questions, right? The questions that Jews are asking are different questions than they've asked in the past, and they are frankly different questions than rabbis have been trained to answer. And that is really I mean, I'll give you an example. And this is from somebody who died 10 years ago this week. All right, Rabbi David Hartman. Okay, and Hartman was, a really, really important thinker in contemporary Judaism, who had rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University and a PhD in philosophy from Fordham. And he said that, he learned how to answer questions at Yeshiva University, and he gets to his pulpit in Montreal, and he's sitting and waiting for people to come, and nobody came to him with questions. So he realized that his job was not to answer questions, but to create them, right? But I would say that, for example, I am trained to answer, Rabbi, how do I keep kosher? Right? I had not historically been trained to answer, Rabbi, why should I keep kosher? Right? And that's a totally different question, right? And, as I was asked the other day, Rabbi, is lab grown meat kosher? Right? Or, Rabbi, should we stop eating beef because of the horrendous impacts that raising beef has on the environment, right? And maybe those two questions go hand in hand, right? I mean, we've learned a lot about sha'at hadacha, right? A halachic ruling that has to be made because of the crisis of the hour, right? Well, maybe there are problems with lab-grown meat, but maybe we overlook some of those problems because if I say I poskin that everybody must stop eating meat, good luck, right? But if I say, you know what, let's all eat lab-grown meat instead because it's better for the environment as well as better for the cows, right? And so we find a way to say it's kosher. Right now, part of the problem too is that, so kosher meat is $20 a pound and lab-grown meat is probably still $200 a pound, but eventually, there will be economies of scale, one would imagine, right? So so there are definitely different questions, and we have to, and this is the thing. if we don't have answers to these questions, right, then people are going to look for those answers elsewhere, right? And so we have to try to find ways of answering them. So I'm going to take a break for a minute in case there are any questions that any of this has prompted. Yeah, D. Need to unmute.
This is not a question. What you're describing is absolutely identical to what happens in education. I'll use public education both at the high school level and at the university level. When I was a student, starting back young, there was only one answer to whatever we were studying, and that's exactly what the teacher said was the answer. And so basically it was teacher tells, student listens, student gives back what teacher asks. Not unlike how parenting starts out with you parent as you were parented, even if you swear you'll never do what your parents did. And you don't learn everything didactically, and you don't learn everything in a prescriptive curriculum like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever. Things change as needs arise. And a perfect example was that when I was a beginning teacher, I taught literature the way I was taught and found a lot of resistance from the students that I was dealing with in the 60s and 70s. Perfect example being, in general, kids hate poetry. And in general, they can't stand Shakespeare. Well, skipping the Shakespeare and going back to the poetry, here I am, a first and second year teacher, and I can't get the kids to do anything with the curriculum of poetry. But I brought in, this is how old it is, a tape deck and started playing folk music, specifically Simon and Garfunkel as an example, Kingston Trio, whatever. And you're talking about wartime, and you're talking about demonstrations, and you're talking about equal rights and so on and so forth. And when you start to teach things like symbolism or conflict or theme, all of a sudden I got all these ingenious responses and lots of energy and kids writing their own poetry. And it isn't that they didn't learn the standard concepts needed in poetry, like rhyming scheme and whatever. It's they needed a different media and a different message to get what they weren't going to get out of the typical textbook. I just hope that you all are seeing the connection that I'm trying to make to what you're saying. And I think some of it that changes is the context of the time and the needs and the demands of the audience you're trying to, not you, but you in general, draw. The other thing that draws things is politics and economics. And we see that right now. Standards were changed in past 2 years on what was required to get a Maryland teaching license, or even to be able to be hired as a substitute. Things laxed or changed or were minimized because they couldn't get what they needed.
Right.
And I think sometimes the reactions that happen in religious institutions is not a whole lot different. Look, and I'm jumping around here, but going back to my Catholic friends' experiences, the whole issue about getting rid of Latin at one point was an attempt to bring in more people to the faith. And now you have another reaction with the orthodoxy, so to speak, wanting to go back to bringing in Latin. So these things happen not just in the religious world.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? All right. So let me throw out a couple of questions that I think the pandemic or the reaction to it has really, and again, I don't know. No, in fact, these questions would have arisen anyway. They just arose more quickly. Like, for example, I was already using Zoom for teaching several years before the pandemic, right? And eventually we would have started live streaming our services and whatever pandemic or no pandemic. I think maybe certain of the things that we've done, like counting a minion over Zoom or letting people lane over Zoom, might not have happened. And so, the sha'at hadachak, the emergency sort of let things come in, maybe let's say with less of a fight, because everybody agreed that it was necessary, right? And once the camel's nose is in the tent, very hard to push the camel back out, right? But so I do think certain things, would have happened eventually, just more slowly and with more of a fight. But so one of the questions I want to ask is, what is the role of place in the new community? Okay, I mean, speaking very personally, it is a continual source of frustration that on the one hand, we insist on maintaining this building that is bankrupting us, and on the other hand, we don't want to use it. We don't want to use it. I mean, people don't, right? I mean, we just had a whole discussion about Purim in person versus on Zoom, right? And one of the points made is that, well, we won't get a minyan in person anyway. I don't know if it's true or it's not true, but I can't say for sure it's not true, right? So on the one hand, we must absolutely maintain this building at all costs, and on the other hand, we don't want to use it. Okay, so and we're not unique. I mean, we may be somewhat unique in our fervent attachment to a particular building, but it's not like every other shul in the country has gone back to, daily minyan in the building and only we are still on Zoom. No, quite the opposite, right? I mean, I would say the majority of shuls are still doing minyanim on Zoom, and those that aren't are having trouble getting an in-person minyan unless it's a very large shul with a lot of people living right there. So, the role of place, I think, is something, and again, this is not unique. It's not unique to shuls. It's also true of, at least, let's say, non-liturgical churches, okay? By which I mean, churches that are not Catholic or Anglican or Orthodox, right? I mean, for Catholics in particular, it's really, you can't distribute communion over Zoom, right? So, and with communion being like the heart of their worship. But, for Protestant churches that don't, I mean, even if they have communion, it's not like the heart of what they do the way it is for Catholic and Orthodox. But so the role of place, okay, but also the role of geography, right? I mean, Marcia's in Chicago, right? I mean, Marcia moved to Chicago 5 years ago, the connection to the community would have disappeared, right? Even Sue Lebowitz, who moved to Northern Virginia, right? Had she moved to Northern Virginia 5 years ago, the connection to the community would have disappeared, right? When Michael Zapor moved to West Virginia, all right, he had 2 kids in high school. He had them every other weekend. He came into the area, got a hotel room, stayed with his kids, brought them to shul, right? Most likely, his connection to our shul would also have evaporated once the kids were in college. But because so much of what we do is now technologically mediated, right? Physical proximity is less important. And, so the role of geography, right? But you now have, I mean, people who belong to shuls that are hundreds of miles from where they live and in a place where they've never lived, or shuls that have no geographic base whatsoever. And you have, like I said, ordination programs that are almost entirely online, right? So what is the role of, and what does community mean, right? And that is a question, right? When we say community, right? We are a Jewish community, right? What does the word community mean anymore when we're talking about people whom we may have never met in person, right? I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I've done 2 certificate programs, one in Jewish education and one in Jewish leadership. Even the one in Jewish education, which made sense because it was Jewish educational technology, made sense that it was primarily an online program, but it was not entirely online, right? And we had in-person gatherings as well at JTS, and everybody in that cohort I met in person at least a couple of times, right? My cohort from Spertus, I have never met a single one of them in person. Some of them I consider friends. I don't know. I mean, we're Facebook friends, but I don't know. Is a Facebook friend really a friend? I don't know anymore. But and this move away from, geographic and contiguity and physical place is only going to accelerate, in my opinion. And when we say community, what does that mean, right? And I'm not sure that I really have an answer to that question. I mean, I think that we are essentially, but it also, as I said 2 weeks ago, it's because we are a community that exists 90%, 95%. I don't even know how to put the figure on it, but we are a community that exists mostly online. And therefore, it is very, very hard to integrate new people, right? I mean, this medium is very good for keeping people together who already know each other, keeping people together who are already part of a pre-existing community. Very, very hard to create a new community or to integrate new people into the community. Alan, go ahead.
Rabbi, what you're describing, in my opinion, really is the basis of what this Danny Schiff was talking about.
Sure.
We're in a new age. We're relying on technology to change us, but keep some semblance. A community can be a bunch of people that wear the same jerseys. I mean, if you take it a little too far. But I want to get back to Dee's point because I think it's really, really pertinent. I remember I had a Milton seminar when I was in college, and I would not really recommend that to anybody, except I loved it. The guy that taught it, of course, he also got into Gilgamesh and he got into Here, There, and Everywhere. But what he said, and what Dee said here, is that the real poets, and this was in the 60s, the real poets are Simon and Garfunkel. The words of the poets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. And Bob Dylan is a poet. The point is, I don't like Shakespeare. Do you watch? Have you ever seen the West Side Story? Yeah, like it. The point is,
Juliet, yep.
and the rabbinate needs to be the point on this, to find ways to integrate folks so that they really do see that this is interesting and this is pertinent. And I'm going to read Schiff's book because I want to see where he goes with it. But it is a different time and age. Every age is different. Really, we were less of a community, and you make this point, Rabbi, as soon as you could drive to a synagogue and park a block away, that changed the community. And that's where we are now. I'm not going to discuss our attachment to that building, although we should. But I think the real crux of our discussion, as our synagogue and other synagogues, is how do we have an outreach that people really find compelling enough to be with us?
Mike, did you want to say something?
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Never
I
mind.
guess so. I think I'd look at the statistics you started with, and I would hope that there would be statistics that would maybe get closer to the mark, which I would see as what is the age of the folks in shuls today compared to 20 years ago. I think that tells a story unto itself.
Right.
It tells of the failure for certain of conservative Judaism to keep kids past bar mitzvah plus a day. And so it's our fault. I think that the pandemic made it actually perversely but easier to get a minyan, and I think that was a good thing. I think that if we didn't have a building, our reason for existence, rightly or wrongly personified, would disappear, and suddenly we simply wouldn't exist. I mean, that's a piece of the glue that I see as life critical. But I also think that keeping the building and doing what we can to keep the ship afloat is our job, pending some sort of change that's obvious. So, for example, a growth in the population, whatever kind of change geographically and among the people here, that might push one way or the other. But our job is to keep the ship afloat as long as humanly possible, so that if it changes, whichever way it changes, it ain't going to be our fault. We did what we could. And I think that's everybody I'm looking at, that's our primary responsibility at this point in time. But your premise, what was the impact of COVID and digital Judaism, if you would, on American Judaism, I'm not sure that's the pulse of the question. I think that's something that's going on, but I don't think one way or the other, like you say. I mean, it's nice that we keep a minyan, but you could never have created us just on Zoom.
Right.
So it's good within what it's doing. It happens to work for us, but it's certainly not the answer, and it shouldn't be the blame either. I mean, why is it that we have trouble getting more than 20 people between Zoom and in person, when there are hundreds of Jews that live within, certainly within clicking distance, but even within walking or driving distance, and it doesn't happen. And it's not just in Gaithersburg that it doesn't happen.
Right.
I think there's a deeper problem going on here that I don't even want to give COVID the credit for the problem, because I think the problem's deeper than that.
No, it's not due to COVID. And in point of fact, I mean, nostalgia is a tricky thing, right? Because the past today is always better than it actually was. Um, you know, I mean, pre-pandemic, I will tell you that when I was preparing a sheet to hand out on Shabbos morning, I made 20 copies. So it's not like, oh my God, we used to get, I'm not talking about 20 years ago, right? When I got here, we were getting 20 people on Shabbos, and we're still getting 20 people on Shabbos. It's just, a different, it's a different mix and a different modality, but it's not any different. I do want to say one thing, and then I want to move, because Stan asked me to ask a good question, and it's a good question, so we'll take a couple minutes. Right? One of the things that Schiff says, according to the interview that I've read with him, and he is right, is that the American Jewish community for a long time has always been chasing a magic bullet. Right? And we've had different magic bullets, right? For a while it was independent minyanim, and for a while it was birthright, and now for many people in the Federation world, fortunately or unfortunately, Chabad is the magic bullet. There is no magic bullet. Okay, there's no magic bullet. It's, the other point that I want to make is that declines of specific institutional forms is not the same thing as the decline of Judaism, right? I mean, and I threw a lot of bleak statistics at you, right? I could also, by cherry pick many positive statistics, right? Like, more than 50%, well more than 50% of children of intermarried parents, their parents say we are raising our kids as Jews. Right now, what does that mean? I'm not sure. Right? When we look at the numbers of kids who are getting any sort of Jewish education, but they are being raised at least to think of themselves as Jews. Right? Moreover, 94% of younger Jews, when asked, are you proud to be Jewish, say, yes, I am proud to be Jewish. Okay, now many of these younger Jews have no Jewish content in their lives as far as I am concerned, right? But they are proud to be Jewish, right? And for a long time, people being far from proud, but being ashamed to be Jewish and running away from their Jewishness and changing their names and so on and so forth, right, was a big problem, right? So there is what to work with. There is what to work with. And, they may not join shuls. All right, it doesn't mean that they don't want to create some form of Jewish life and Jewish community, right? Similarly, I mean, I care what happens to Kehilat Shalom, right? I mean, part of the reason that I care, I mean, aside from the fact that it's my community, and I do feel, right, my previous two shuls that I was the rabbi of, I did not feel that they were my community. I felt that they were my employer, right? I feel that this shul is my community, right? I have no interest whatsoever in what happens to the United Synagogue. And I have no interest whatsoever in what happens to conservative Judaism as an institution. right? Forms change and they, and I think the point that Schiff makes is that Reform and conservative Judaism did their job, okay? And now there's a different job, right? One of the problems that we have in the American Jewish community is that it is vanishingly rare for an organization to say, we did our job, so let's close up shop, right? No. You have organizations for Soviet Jewry, right? 30 years after the Soviet Union no longer exists, right? Instead of saying we did our job, now it's time to close up, right? It's right. Or an organization exists to cure a disease, the disease is cured. So now we have to find a different raison d'etre, right? I think Schiff is saying, conservative and reform did their job, take your gold watch and retire, right? There's a different job now, and maybe we can't do it, right? But, yes, shuls have always existed, but the affiliation model that we have has not always existed, right? In the shtetl, you had the shoemaker shul and the baker shul and the butcher shul, whatever, and people didn't necessarily pay dues, not didn't necessarily, they didn't pay dues. They made contributions to, but so, let's not confuse form with substance. I see your handy. I got a couple points that I want to, no, it's okay, but I want to really make. So there is what to work with. So Stan threw at me the question of, how has your Jewish practice changed since the pandemic? And I want to amend that and say not only your Jewish practice, but your Jewish belief, if applicable, has that changed at all due to the pandemic? And Stan, since you were the one who came up with the question, I think it's only fair that you take the first crack at it.
Thank you. No, I think we've worked very hard to keep our practices in home the same as they had always been. The only change has been our choice between being in shul or being online. And being online is often a matter of health issues and whether or not we care to travel.
Sure.
So I can say about that. So the bottom line is we have not changed in these 2 years. The pandemic has not forced us or encouraged us to change.
Anybody else want to take a crack at it? Yeah, Marcia. You need to unmute. Marcia, you need to unmute.
Okay,
Okay.
for some reason, my cursor wasn't going where I wanted it to go. I've made the biggest change, and it's been a real adjustment. For the time that I lived in Gaithersburg, my life pretty much continued the same, except for not going to shul. It's what I did is what I did regularly, something I just continued doing everything except not going to shul. Since I moved here, a couple of things. First of all, this is the first time since I left Chicago in 1966 that I'm living in really an almost solidly Jewish environment. And it has really been interesting because the facility is not kosher. I still keep kosher. I've become a vegetarian here. And my kitchen is kosher. When I want meat, I get kosher meat, and I make and I cook. As far as going to shul, I have to face two at my age. I don't drive anymore.
Right.
So for someone like me, even if I were still living in Gaithersburg, the Zoom element would be very important, because otherwise I could not participate. And that's one thing, you think about. It's not only, people who can't get there. Probably living there would have gotten rides or things like that.
Sure.
But basically, I couldn't do that myself. And here I can't. However, when my niece, who lives nearby, goes to shul, which she does when I don't Zoom, it's because I've gone in person. I have to say, there was nothing like being in person for a service.
Right.
And it's definitely a feeling. And that community is a little unusual in that it shrunk somewhat as a result of Zoom and some other issues that are not related to Zoom, but they still get over 100 people for Shabbat. It's a kind of community, because it's stable. You've got 3 generations. It's conservative, but it's a very observant conservative community. Half the families send their kids to Solomon Schechter, the day school. So there is a commitment there. And that's why, it's the pleasure of seeing that, but you don't have that in Kehilat Shalom. And that's part of it. But it's been an adjustment. I can see the advantages of both, but at my age, having the Zoom is really important.
Sure. Anybody else? Yeah, Dee.
Hard for me to put into words what I've been scribbling down on paper. It's not so much for myself that I'm married to our quote building itself, but I'm a person that was raised in a family that originated from a religious family 2 generations ago, and then evolved into not being so religious and being cultural, and then coming back and trying to become observant. And I was an outsider, and sometimes I probably still am. But there is something about when you say, what is community? And as you described how, and I'm delighted to hear you say that, how you describe your own feelings about Kehilat Shalom, irrespective of whether it's a building or it's people, is very much the way I feel. There is something about a shul, whether it's a storefront, whether it's a magnificent edifice, there is something about a shul that's a magnet, whether it's for people who come on a regular basis or people who come for somebody else's celebration. When I really began to feel it was when members in my family were critically ill and in fact died. And I can remember standing up to say Kaddish for my mother and sitting Shiva. And people came that had seen me in shul or that I had seen, but we didn't know each other. And there's something that happens even in the most dysfunctional group and even in the most dysfunctional and contesting time. There's something about the people in Kehilat Shalom that somehow or other come together. They don't have to be prodded. They don't have to be kicked. They don't have to be made to feel guilty. They just come. And sometimes it's a collection of people that you would never expect to come for you. And that's very infectious and very contagious, because speaking for myself, I couldn't possibly fail to come for somebody else that I knew was in need. And that didn't come from going to Hebrew school. And that didn't come from going to a synagogue as prestigious as B'nai Israel. That came from this group. And it's kind of hard for me to even say this without tears in my eyes. But to answer the question that you asked before, in our worst of times, there is just something about this place that when it's really necessary, be it the best celebration or the worst tragedy, that folks are there. And I agree 100% that Zoom exclusively would not have accommodated or met the needs of new folks coming to figure out what we're all about. But one of the things that I tried, and I've seen other people try, pre-pandemic when we were there, I couldn't stand seeing somebody come into synagogue that we had never seen before, sitting by themselves and feeling alone. What am I doing here? I don't feel anything. And there's nothing like somebody coming up to you and saying, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, welcome. Can I sit with you? Here's our book," whatever. Somebody that I think has just forever done a great job with that is Bobby, in the way that she reaches out to talk to people new in the community and to help I'm looking at everybody sitting here has been touched by something that would not have been as supported as what Good and Welfare has done. I'm having a really hard time saying what I'm thinking, but I think it needs to be said, because we don't really compliment ourselves in between our fighting for the really neat and wonderful things that we've done at one time or another. So I, for one, grew up in a family that evolved into definitely needing a synagogue, regardless of what you call it. And my family was very prominent in B'nai Israel. And my being welcomed was on the shoulders of my parents and my grandparents, but never for me in my own right. And so, like you say, Rabbi, you can't deliver communion by Zoom. And there is something about this community that you can't deliver by Zoom, but it is keeping a spark alive for those of us that don't want to quit trying. Sorry for the filibuster, but that came from the heart.
All right. We are running really long, so I will shut it down. Thank you for coming tonight. It was I should say it was interesting since I spoke the most, but
Always.
I mean that there are some tough questions, and I have to admit, I will fall back on Hartman, that the job of the rabbi is to provoke questions and not to give answers. Because if I had to give answers, I'd be a tsaritz, but I know what the question think. All right. Good night, folks.
Thank you, Rabbi.